First of all, I was really pleased to be on this panel with the two other speakers, and I'm sorry to miss the Q&A bit together at the end, because it would be lovely to hear their thoughts as well. But what I'm going to talk about is a project which is now finished, actually, which we called Who's Right to the Smart City, which focused on India, UK and Brazil, but particularly looking at marginalised communities and how they might see the right to the smart. So we've put the smart into the right to the city. So I think it's quite useful to use a Lefebvrean sort of way of thinking to understand what smartness might mean in terms of participation or governance. And if we look at Lefebvre's definition, the idea of participation is implicit in the right to the city, but it's also the right to the centre and the right to be included, or the right to difference and information. So I think obviously Lefebvre never dealt with smart, but thinking through some of that framework can be quite useful to understand what this idea of participation might mean. And the reason we did this project is we did a project prior to that, which was a network which focused on in Brazil. So again, global south type context. And what we found was, well, a lot of myth about smart and what actually was smart, but that smart was really quite implicitly, and not just passively, but implicitly and proactively creating urban inequality. It was actually sort of it was doing that, and particularly in India, where the Smart Cities mission is sort of perpetuating some existing projects as a JNURM. We're seeing how smart is, for all its talk, is actually an urban exclusion policy. So you get issues around displacement, segregation through land use planning, reinforcing digital divides, gender disparities, and excluding from the economic benefits of development. So that's that was pretty across the scale. And again, we've looked at it specifically in India, Brazil, but actually, wherever you look at smart, some of these aspects of this, of how people are being excluded from benefiting from what might be a smart city, we're seeing. So I've done some commentary on Smart London, and the same stuff. I'm pretty sure that we're seeing the same pattern of inequalities. It might not be as explicit, but it's there. So I think smart, whatever it might be on the tin, actually create. So as Iona's highlighted, so thinking about digital citizenship, but also thinking about the people on the margins and how they might benefit from it is important. So thinking about who's right to the smart city. And there's two themes I'm going to pick up on, which were specifically came out of the work we did in smart city projects in India, which was focused around Chennai. So we had a partner in Chennai who we worked with, and this was a couple of years ago now, so I'm not necessarily fully up to date with exactly how the implementation has happened, but this was sort of a bit of work we did then. But if we think about smart, there seems to be two things that create patterns of inclusion or exclusion. The first is the sort of the efficiency paradigm. So smart is this idea that cities have problems, which we all know they do anyway, which is fine. We like problems, but problems, if you're an IT company, are bad. And that the solution is technology. So, whack chips or something at it. And I'm generally I see technology as socially productive, but in the way the model that's being driven through a lot of this sort of large-scale smart city projects, this efficiency paradigm is not efficiency that is in any way beneficial to people. It's beneficial to the technology companies and to some extent as a pattern of control, because efficiency is just another way of saying we're going to take governance into a more centralised system. So it uses technology to create patterns of exclusion by saying that efficiency tends to be the people who are messy and on the edges, and the spaces that are messy on the edges are inefficient and they should be cleansed from that system. And then the other point around smart city is this, the right to centrality. So this efficiency model also creates patterns of displacement and exclusion. So again, and that reinforces urban equality. So what we're seeing is if the centre is sort of a smart centre, the people who are not included in that smart centre are either sort of physically displaced or displaced through lack of skills. So the right to benefit is often not in the margins. And there are some quite practical things in where smart city projects literally create patterns of the dirty stuff is moved somewhere else and the clean is kept, and you get this centre and margin thing being reinforced. I think that might be quite interesting in terms of the smaller smart cities and how you can probably see that a lot more clearly. So what we did is we had a project in Chennai working with a local activist organisation, so Civic Action Consumer Group, who led a lot of the work we did there. It was a 2-day workshop. It's sort of limited in terms of the outcomes, but I'm thinking from what we've heard from some of the other people that some of these findings sort of seem to correlate. So again, Chennai has the 2-scale approach with an area called Tinagar, which is the area-based development, and that's the area we focused on. And we did both a study of the policy documents around what was proposed to the smart city and the actual existing smart city in that particular area, which is sort of effectively around this radial of 4 streets. Tinagar is actually the shopping district of Chennai, and it's incredibly busy. I think it's known as one of the busiest streets in the world, which I thought sounded a bit stupid before, but actually when I've been there, it's very, there is a very busy space. And we did a policy analysis looking at some of the policy documents for that particular project and seeing how they're implemented on the ground. And then we did some mapping in the actual space to try and understand what was actually there and how the smart city might affect it. So first, if we looked at this urban efficiency paradigm, Chennai's documents very clearly have this efficiency. So it's around traffic, where they're going to replace messy traffic with smart bus and e-rickshaws. Waste, where they're going to replace messy, complicated waste bins with waste management. Again, water supply, sewage, stormwater, flood, and all of this was around this urban efficiency paradigm and was based on establishing that the need for that based on a crisis of things not working, which may or may not be the case, but whether this was the right solution. So if we look at waste as an example, so they had this fantastic idea to put GPS sensors on the bins, and then it was brilliant. And I think MIT had done it, so it must be good. And they were going to put these sensors on all the bins, and then when the bins were full, they would sort of alert this, and I am being sarcastic here, they would alert this central monitoring system, and it would be a bit like then that would swing into action, and the bins would get emptied. Which Western model that's failed. So first of all, you're shipping out a westernized model to a global south context. One, it didn't work here, so why would it work there? That's part of the problem. But by automating it, what you're doing is excluding a large sort of informal labour force that operate around rubbish management in Chennai. And again, I'm less familiar with the actual reality of waste management in India. It's not my expertise, but from sort of incidental, the way that waste is managed is it's very much an ecosystem of waste with people, different services offering informal and informal workers. So this efficiency paradigm may sound great on paper, but actually what it's going to do is drive out an informal sector who maybe operate in that space. And the same rhetoric was turning through water, power. Exactly the same idea is privatising public services, excluding informal and much more locally based systems, and sort of centralising it, and to some extent selling it off. So the efficiency paradigm was a way to, and we've talked about this, the business model behind it as well. I'm going to skip this lady, but we asked a couple of people informally in the street, what was smart city? And the good news is everyone had an answer, which you don't get in London, for example. The bad news is everyone had a different answer, and they were all right. They were sure that the smart city. So this lady said the smart city means we're going to be like you, and I was like, well, I don't think you want to be like the West, but no, it was going to be all new and modern, and so the smart, she'd taken that sort of smart city mantra and was quite happy to reproduce it. So there's a good marketing strategy, at least. So the other aspect of smart city is this exclusion from the centre. So what we found in the street space in Chennai is you've got multiple people occupying that street space, and they're seen as encroachments. And I think JNURM had tried to manage this encroachment in the city space, but you've got street traders, rickshaw drivers, shoppers, and a whole range of informal economic activities. And what Smart City was doing was essentially saying that those needed to be moved out of the space and to be cleaned. That they were somehow, seen as they need to be sanitised and excluded. So what we've got was what was interesting is in the stakeholder workshop is we had representatives from the Street Hawkers Association, and they've been protesting quite actively. Again, this is now a year and a half old. To their right to the smart city, which was not to be excluded from the street space and to lose their livelihood. So this was from their Facebook page. So the Street Hawkers Association, again, coming from a Western context, we think of street traders, but when I asked the guy in the like what his membership was, it's like 40 million. So that's a large sector of the informal economic sector is very large. So this exclusion, and then the practicality of it was that these informal the street traders were literally being displaced and were being told to move into a dedicated market space somewhere else. So there was a literal displacement, a spatial displacement. So again, this point where who's right to the centre, who has the smart is removing those people from the space where they make their livelihoods. But do we really need to be that worried? So in Chennai, which is one of the first round, and again, this is anecdotal rather than I don't have a lot of evidence around this, but they haven't delivered on any of these projects because they can't, because they haven't understood what the street is like and what the city's like. So whether we need to be whether actually the smart city is destroying itself, and that's fine. And then just to come up, I became very, very critical of what the smart meant, but I do think there's a need for us to reclaim smart. If we've got the right to the city, to some extent, we've let a lot of policymakers and big business tell us what smart is, and that's both in the European context and the global south. And there's a real need to reclaim smartness and what it means and recognise what's already smart. We talked about QR codes, all that sort of stuff. So this was just a little example I've got quite a few examples, but I won't go into them. But this was just what I thought was really smart. So this is a tree in the street space, and they'd hacked the electricity supply and got a cola bottle or a 7-Up bottle and turned that into a light. So that's smart. That's probably a problem to lots of people, but that's really what smart should be. So I think there's this real need to reclaim what smart is and start to say what we think it is, and especially for communities to be able to do that. Actually the technology and governance model that underpins many smart technologies, not smart projects, is full of potential for marginalised groups. It can be accessible. You've got Internet of Things sensors, they're cheap as chips. Connectivity, you get cheap Wi-Fi, you connect, sharing, all of that potential around connectivity is really not being exploited because people are being told it's not for them or are not being enabled to understand what it means. So if we treat urban informality as not a condition but a mode of production with sites of vibrant and entrepreneurial urbanism, that's what smart is. And if we can make people understand that they already are smart, especially in informal settlements and informal economies, they are very smart because they've had to be. I think that's where there's a need to raise awareness. So yeah, there's what could be smart rather than what we're being told is smart. Yes, so I'll finish there. That's the other partners in the network who I'm talking through today, and I'm very sorry that I have to shoot off and not join in the other session, but I will be staying for your talks. But if you would like to, if you've got any questions now, I'd be quite happy to answer them. Thank you.
Okay. Some questions for Katharine? Anyone?
So,
I'm listening, sorry.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. So my question is a bit general, but it's basically trying to understand the fact that if smart cities are also technologically enabled cities and cities that are disenfranchising citizens through technological pursuits, then they're also a form of a city where expert-led knowledges are kind of crowding out other local knowledges, and somewhere when you ended with what is also jugaad is that that smartness, the inherent smartness of any working city. I mean, at the end of the day, all cities are working. That's why they're there, and in that context, I'm just wondering how much of this smartness is also a way of manufacturing consent and manufacturing opinion around more expert-led knowledges and more control around the state expanding beyond the state and asserting control. And I'm just trying to think about.
Yeah, I mean.
Maybe we just take.
Okay.
Yeah, let's just take who will then.
Very brief question. Thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering that I'm going to play the devil advocate a little bit in this comment, but because you have provoked with this example of the bottle of a Sprite, I'm an advocate always about social innovation, but I think this is social innovation, and we should distinguish 3 levels at least. That is something emergent, that is social innovation, but I think that the role of the private sector should be also reshaped. And the 3rd level would be that the governance should have some other kind of instrumentarium. I mean, it's why I agree 100% with your presentation, but I think that we should be very sincere with our proposals. And one thing is the social innovation that has some limitations because society could be emergent until to some extent, but then we need to really get involved the private sector in another dynamics and also experiment, as I said in the previous comment, with governance. Nicely, okay?
Thank you. My question is, the idea of rights in smart cities is a very interesting concept. In India, if you look at the smart city guidelines or the proposals that were put forth, they very swiftly have not mentioned rights at all. They talk about inclusion. Consistently, they talk about equality and inclusion, and I find it very interesting that the idea of inclusion is also effectively almost a trickle-down theory. Like, smart cities will be economic hubs, everyone will have an economic advantage, and therefore you will be included in the city. It's not your actual right to the city. So I don't know if this is a comment or a question, but I think somewhere, this is something I'm sort of playing with in my mind. How do you bring back the idea of rights into a space that does not acknowledge that it's talking about it or ignoring it?
Okay, right, I'll try and remember bit by bit. So the first is, we had this discussion in the previous session about whether smart city is political. Like, of course, yeah. I mean, like that's what we've not been told, and so it's ultimately entirely political, and any way we interact with technology is political. So the governance model where it's like, yay, you're going to get a smart city, aren't you lucky? No, because you are being denied your right to. It's inherently a governance model, and we're being sold some Kool-Aid, and underneath it is a really dangerous, scarily. I've seen in Brazil when you just see the control rooms, and you're like, it's the police running things, and you're like, okay, so it's a governance model. So smart city is a bit of kit hidden behind what is essentially a scary. So the need to go to a citizen to either make people aware of that so that they can contest it in some way, but if we sort of, this engagement is fake engagement because it isn't, the governance model is flawed, and it's a political, again, so that is the need to be aware of that, I think, and the issue of governance with smart cities. It's sort of hidden behind a lot of rhetoric. So I don't know, I'm trying to remember what the questions were. I'm not very good. The second one, there's social innovation. there is something specific about SMART. There's some specific, the social innovation more generally. I think there are some aspects of SMART, particularly what we do, what you can do around IoT type sensors, what you can think about in terms of network connectivity. There is something which you can characterize as SMART, which might then be seen, you can sort of see some of those sharing platforms. I think you can characterize digital social innovation that maybe has a SMART characteristic that has been enabled by things like low-cost sensors, things like easy connectivity, through sharing platforms, participatory budgeting, things like that, which sort of become SMART. So that's where the bottle, whether we could characterize that as SMART social innovation or not, maybe, I don't know, but I do think SMART is something. It isn't just a label to some extent, but the need to reclaim it for what it could be rather than what we're being told what it is probably, so I don't know if that answers the second question. And the third question, can I remember? Can you just remind me what the...
Rights to the city.
Yeah, right to the city. Well, interestingly, so our other partner in this project, and I haven't talked about the work we did in Brazil, but in Brazil, right to the city is enshrined within the constitution. So there's this idea that you can have a constitutional right. Again, the model of governance, and interestingly, the smart city projects in Brazil have a very different characteristic. They're less urban regeneration, and they're much more based around fiber connectivity, for example. So I think the challenge, particularly in the Indian context and the right to the city, is SMART is just perpetuating what has been, stuff that has been done through urban regeneration initiatives for many. So the SMART label is just another label to deny that right. So thinking through the right to the city may be something that needs to happen in an Indian context much more generally, but whether the SMART is the reason to do that, I don't know. It's just another example of why. So essentially the SMART is a label being put on another urban regeneration initiative. So the right aspect is there, whether you have SMART or not. It's just perpetuating it and probably exacerbating it a little bit more. So I don't know, that doesn't really answer your question, but I think that's a bigger issue potentially. Anyway, I shall finish there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.